morning sky over Bougainville was a pale metallic blue, flat, depthless, and hostile. At 0934 hours, 4 silver shapes cut across it in perfect silence. The Lockheed P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron were running on the last gallons of their drop tanks, throttled back to conserve every ounce of fuel. They had been airborne for more than 2 hours, flying 435 miles across open ocean under radio silence, skimming the waves so low that the propellers threw salt spray against the undercarriage doors. Rex T. Barber sat in the cockpit of his P-38G, Miss Virginia, her twin Allison engines thrumming at 2,300 RPM. His eyes flicked between the fuel gauge and the horizon. Sweat crawled under his oxygen mask. He knew the numbers by heart: 160 gallons in the mains, 310 in the drop tanks, cruising at 230 knots. A mistake in mixture or prop setting, and he'd run dry before the rendezvous point. There would be no rescue, no radio beacon, no second chance. At 0934, the voice of Major John W. Mitchell broke radio silence for the first time. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." Barber looked up and saw them. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, green ovals against the white horizon, moving in echelon at 4,500 feet. Escorting them, 6 A-6M0s in loose trail. The Japanese formation was punctual to the minute, just as the decrypted message had promised. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was on board one of those bombers, flying his morning inspection run from Rabaul to Balale. Mitchell's voice again. "Go get him." The P-38s dropped their tanks. Metal clanged and spun away, splashing into the sea below. Barber nosed down, pushed the throttles forward, and felt the aircraft surge. The Allison engines screamed, their turbo superchargers spooling up with a rising metallic whine. The Lightning accelerated through 350 knots, climbing into firing position. Barber could see the lead bomber clearly now, the long, slender fuselage, the twin engines, the red Hinomaru Rising Sun insignia on the wings. In the greenhouse nose, he imagined Yamamoto sitting stiff-backed, dressed in white gloves, staring ahead at the endless Pacific. The Betty's gunners spotted the attackers too late. Their tracers flickered upward, thin orange sparks against the blue. Barber pressed the trigger. The Lightning's nose-mounted armament, 4.50 caliber Brownings and a single 20mm cannon, erupted in a single converging stream. Tracers lanced across 400 yards, walked up the bomber's fuselage, tore through the right engine. Black smoke boiled out. A gout of flame followed. The Betty rolled hard to the right, trailing a comet's tail of fire. Barber followed through, firing again. He saw pieces of the wing tear away, a flash of metal, then a sudden bloom of orange. The bomber's right wing folded. In that instant, the aircraft inverted, nose down, and fell like a burning leaf. The explosion came seconds later, a muffled orange detonation among the jungle ridges. Barber climbed through the debris field. His hands were steady, his breathing calm. He didn't cheer. He didn't even speak. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. Below, on the jungle floor of Bougainville, Japanese search parties would later find the wreckage. Among the twisted aluminum and charred uniforms lay the remains of Admiral Yamamoto, still strapped into his seat, sword across his lap, wristwatch stopped at 0934. For the Americans, the mission would be logged as Operation Vengeance, a textbook intercept, a feat of navigation, gunnery, and discipline. But hidden within its precision was a secret that no after-action report recorded. Back at Guadalcanal, in a dimly lit hangar, a mechanic named Charles Mac McNeely had watched those same P-38s take off hours earlier. He was not on the flight roster, nor in the official briefing. His name did not appear in the mission orders, but his fingerprints were on every Lightning that made it back that day. 3 weeks before the mission, McNeely had broken protocol. He'd spliced a new line into the drop tank fuel system, an illegal modification, unapproved by Lockheed or the Air Corps, devised to prevent vapor lock and uneven feed at low altitude. The change was minor, almost invisible, but it had solved a persistent failure that grounded countless lightnings in the tropics. He had done it without orders, risking court-martial if discovered. That morning, every aircraft on the Yamamoto mission carried his forbidden handiwork. Not one suffered a fuel interruption. Not one aborted. When Barber throttled up to intercept and felt both Allisons respond without hesitation, it was McNeely's idea that made that moment possible. The headlines would name the pilots, the admirals, the cryptographers, and the strategists. But the decisive margin, the few seconds of power, the unbroken fuel flow that let the lightnings climb into the kill, came from a man with grease on his hands who refused to follow the book. History would call Operation Vengeance a triumph of planning and bravery. But in truth, it was a victory of invention. For over Bougainville that day, it wasn't just a pilot who changed the course of the Pacific War. It was the spark of mechanical audacity, the defiance of one unseen craftsman, that turned raw aluminum and fuel into America's deadliest fighter. Charles Mac McNeely had no diploma hanging over his workbench, no officer's bars on his shoulder, no right to rewrite aircraft design. What he had were hands that could feel stress through metal, and a brain that itched whenever a machine didn't behave exactly as it should. At Lockheed's Burbank plant in 1941, that itch was constant. The P-38 Lightning was the most ambitious fighter America had ever built. Twin booms, twin engines, turbo superchargers, tricycle landing gear, and a center nacelle that looked more like a torpedo than an airplane. It was the brainchild of a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, who'd fought tooth and nail to get it approved. The Army Air Corps wanted a 400-mile-per-hour interceptor. Johnson gave them a 420-mile-per-hour monster. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was temperamental. By late 1942, the Lightning's greatest strength, its range, was being strangled by its weakest link, the external fuel system. The drop tanks, meant to extend flight distance across the Pacific's vast emptiness, had an ugly habit of starving the engines mid-flight. Fuel wouldn't feed properly. Air bubbles formed in the lines under low pressure, cutting off supply and killing engines with no warning. Ground crews called it the hiccup. Pilots called it something worse. McNeely, then a line mechanic attached to the 339th Squadron on Guadalcanal, watched too many of those hiccups turn fatal. A Lightning that lost power over ocean had no chance. The twin-engine design offered redundancy, but not if both Allisons coughed at once. He'd seen it happen. He'd helped pull wreckage from the surf. The official fix from headquarters was bureaucratic and slow. Recalibrate pressure valves, replace faulty gaskets, wait for new parts. McNeely didn't have the luxury of waiting. Every morning, new pilots took off with the same defect ticking inside their wings. One night, after a 14-hour shift, he sat on an overturned fuel drum and studied the Lightning's plumbing diagram by flashlight. 2 lines from the external tanks fed into a selector manifold before joining the main. At high altitudes, the system worked fine. At low level, the heat and pressure imbalance caused vapor lock. The simplest cure, installing a direct bleed line between the drop tank feed and the vent, was technically against regulations. It altered a certified system without engineering approval. He stared at the schematic for a long time, then muttered, "To hell with the regs." The next morning, he borrowed a short length of fuel hose, 2 clamps, and a brass T-connector. With the crew chief distracted, he crawled up the wing route of Miss Virginia, the P-38 assigned to Lieutenant Rex Barber, and spliced the extra line into place. It took less than 20 minutes. He logged the modification as fuel vent calibration adjustment. When Barber taxied out that afternoon for a test hop, McNeely watched from the revetment. The Lightning roared down the coral strip, lifted clean, and climbed without sputter. He waited for the familiar cough. None came. The engines stayed smooth through climb and descent. When Barber returned, he reported the fuel flow steady as a church clock. McNeely said nothing. Over the next week, he repeated the change on 5 more aircraft, each time marking the paperwork with some vague maintenance code. The other mechanics started to notice. "You trying to get us grounded?" one asked. McNeely only grinned. "Trying to keep us in the air." The risk was real. Unauthorized modification of flight systems could mean court-martial under wartime conditions. But word spread among pilots that McNeely's planes were the only ones not hiccuping at altitude. They started requesting him by name. The squadron commander didn't ask questions. Results spoke louder than forms. Then came the intelligence briefing. April 14th, 1943. A coded message decrypted by U.S. Navy cryptanalysts in Hawaii revealed that Admiral Yamamoto would be flying a predictable route near Bougainville. The plan that emerged required an intercept 430 miles from base, beyond the safe combat radius of most fighters. Only the P-38 with drop tanks could do it. But the drop tanks were still untrustworthy, and every pilot knew it. The mission's precision depended on fuel endurance to the minute. McNeely listened from the back of the hangar as officers debated. He knew the numbers. Without uninterrupted feed, at least half the flight would have to abort before contact. He also knew that his illegal line had already solved the issue. That night he worked quietly by lamplight, making sure every lightning assigned to the mission bore his secret signature, a short length of extra hose hidden under the panelling, a sliver of brass where none was supposed to be. When dawn came and the lightnings rolled to the line, he stood off to one side and wiped his hands on a rag. The engines started clean, smooth, synchronized. Not a single misfire. He didn't salute the departing formation, he wasn't supposed to, but he watched until the last silver shape vanished into the eastern haze, carrying his unapproved idea into combat. The others went to breakfast. McNeely stayed where he was, listening to the distant echo of engines fading toward history. He'd broken the rules, signed no design sheet, and risked his career. Yet he'd done what no engineer at Burbank had dared. He'd trusted intuition over authority. Somewhere in the Pacific sky, the proof was already burning its way toward destiny. Dawn, April 18th, 1943. The air above Guadalcanal hung heavy and wet, a grey film of mist still clinging to the palms as the first P-38 Lightnings rolled onto the strip. Each aircraft carried twin 165-gallon drop tanks, ungainly bulbous bellies of metal that would make the mission either a triumph or a disaster. Major John Mitchell, commanding the flight, checked his watch. 0700 hours, 16 Lightnings. No bombers, no escorts. The mission plan had been rehearsed a dozen times, down to the second. They would fly 600 miles round trip, cross open ocean for 2 hours, and arrive over Bougainville at precisely 9:35. If they were late, Yamamoto would already be gone. If they were early, they would risk alerting every Japanese radar on the island chain. No one in the briefing room that morning was under any illusion. This wasn't just another sortie. This was Operation Vengeance, a precision strike to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. The order came directly from President Roosevelt. The route was drawn from a single decrypted message. The margin for error, 0. As the Lightnings lifted from the strip, their superchargers shrieked against the damp air. Below, mechanics like McNeely watched until the noise faded to silence. Every man on the line knew the risk. The P-38's Allison engines were notorious for quitting under fuel starvation. One hiccup in the plumbing could drop the whole squadron into the ocean. But this time the engines purred with an unfamiliar steadiness. Mitchell led the formation to 10,000 feet, throttling back to conserve fuel. The plan required radio silence, so the pilots flew by stopwatch and instinct. Each Lightning was stripped of unnecessary weight. No external gun sights, minimal ammunition, reduced oxygen gear. The extra ounces meant extra minutes of flight. 2.5 hours in, somewhere over the Solomon Sea, the first test of endurance arrived. Lieutenant Lanfear checked his gauges. Fuel flow steady, both engines balanced. In earlier missions, vapor lock had appeared by now. None did. Every lightning held pressure. McNeely's hidden line, unknown to the pilots, unauthorized by the manuals, was keeping them alive. At 0932, the coast of Bougainville appeared, a dark green claw rising from blue water. Mitchell's flight dropped to 50 feet above the waves, so low that the propeller wash trailed ribbons of spray. The sun was behind them. The timing was perfect. Time, Mitchell mouthed to himself, glancing at his wristwatch. 3 minutes to intercept. Above the treetops, a glint of silver appeared. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. Yamamoto's aircraft led the formation, its tail code T1-323 clearly visible through the morning haze. Mitchell's formation split cleanly. 4 Lightnings broke upward to block the escort fighters. The others, led by Lieutenant Rex Barber, swung wide to intercept the bombers. Barber rolled into a climb, throttles full forward, the twin Allisons howling. He felt the Lightning leap as though unburdened by gravity. The first bursts of fire streaked ahead, tracer rounds from the P-38's concentrated nose guns. Unlike other fighters, the Lightning's weapons didn't spread. They converged through the propeller hub, forming a single surgical cone of death. Barber's rounds stitched the Betty's right wing, sparks and smoke trailing as fuel lines ruptured. The Japanese gunners returned fire, but their angle was wrong. The Lightning was too fast. At 0934, a burst caught the Betty amidships. Flames engulfed the fuselage. Barber's eyes widened as the bomber's wing tore free, spiraling into jungle canopy. The explosion echoed across Bougainville's shoreline. The second Betty tried to dive toward the sea. Lieutenant Besby Holmes, closing from above, fired a short burst. The plane disintegrated in mid-air. In less than 45 seconds, both targets were gone. The escorting Zeros, too distant to intervene, wheeled helplessly. Mitchell's flight turned south immediately. No victory rolls, no chatter. Fuel was life, and every drop counted. The formation skimmed the ocean once more, engines still running smooth. Back at Guadalcanal, word spread before the wheels touched coral. Yamamoto was dead. The Japanese High Command wouldn't confirm it for days, but Allied intelligence already knew. The architects of Pearl Harbor had been struck down by a squadron that by all calculations should never have reached him. When Barber climbed out of Miss Virginia, his flight suit drenched with sweat, he noticed McNeely standing near the revetment. The mechanic said nothing. He only nodded once, eyes fixed on the smooth idling engines. Barber later recalled, "We'd flown farther than any P-38 had a right to. Engines never coughed once. It was as if the planes themselves wanted Yamamoto dead. No one wrote McNeely's name in the mission report. No one mentioned the unapproved line of hose under each wing. Official records credited the P-38's design, the pilot's skill, and the precision of U.S. Navy intelligence. The paperwork never acknowledged the quiet rebellion that had made the flight possible. But among the ground crews, the story spread like contraband scripture. The Lightning's long, impossible reach that day wasn't born in a laboratory. It was born on a fuel drum, under a mechanic's flashlight, by a man who decided that saving pilots mattered more than following rules. That morning over Bougainville, every bullet, every vapor trail, every second of endurance had flowed through that forbidden line. The mission that changed the Pacific War owed its existence not just to strategy or courage, but to one unrecorded act of mechanical defiance. Burbank, California. September 1942. The Lockheed plant roared like a city unto itself, 1,000 machines hammering, cutting, riveting in rhythm. Aluminum dust hung in the air, catching the sunlight like metallic pollen. Men and women worked side by side, sleeves rolled, faces streaked with oil and determination. The war had turned factories into front lines. Every rivet was a bullet, every assembly line a battlefield. At the centre of that storm stood Clarence Kelly Johnson, 32 years old, chief engineer, visionary, and by many accounts a madman. He'd designed the P-38 Lightning in defiance of convention, twin booms, counter-rotating propellers, and a central nacelle crammed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. To his superiors, it had looked like a dragonfly built by a lunatic. But it worked. Still, the Lightning had an Achilles heel: range. In the Pacific, distances swallowed aircraft whole. From Henderson Field to Rabaul was over 500 miles. Japanese Zeros could make it easily. The P-38 couldn't. It was fast, lethal, and utterly unsuited for the vastness of the ocean war. That limitation haunted men like Master Sergeant Douglas McNeely, a line mechanic on the 339th Fighter Squadron, whose workspace was the tarmac, whose tools were wrenches worn thin by salt air and sweat. McNeely had watched pilots take off for long-range escorts and never return. He knew the sound of an engine dying from starvation. He knew what empty tanks meant. Officially, Lockheed's engineers insisted the Lightning couldn't handle more than a pair of 165-gallon external tanks. The plumbing wasn't rated for sustained suction from both simultaneously. Too much draw, they said, would cause vapor lock, cut engine power, or worse, rupture the pressure lines. McNeely disagreed. He didn't have blueprints, just instinct, an old slide rule, and a sense for machines that bordered on superstition. "Engines talk," he'd say, wiping his hands on a rag. "You just have to know their language." One humid night in late March 1943, under blackout conditions, he broke the rules. With a cigarette stub clenched between his teeth, McNeely crawled beneath Miss Virginia, a P-38 assigned to Lieutenant Rex Barber. Using stolen fittings from the maintenance shed, he spliced a bypass line connecting the auxiliary tanks directly into the engine feed, an unauthorized modification that effectively doubled fuel draw capacity. It was a simple act of mechanical heresy. A few feet of aluminum tubing, some gaskets, and a bet that the Allisons wouldn't choke. He tested the modification in secret. With the help of Corporal Tex Dyer, he ran the engines at idle, then at full throttle. The gauges barely flickered. The engines ran smooth. The new line balanced pressure between tanks, feeding fuel evenly. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. When McNeely reported his results to the squadron engineering officer, he was reprimanded. "Unauthorized modification of Army Air Forces property," the citation read. "Subject to disciplinary action." The paperwork was quietly buried, thanks to Captain Mitchell, who understood what it meant. He told McNeely, "If this holds, you just bought our boys another 100 miles of life." Word spread across the 339th like wildfire. By the end of the week, nearly every P-38 on the line bore McNeely's signature modification. The men called it the illegal line. In April, when the order came down for the Yamamoto mission, it was that same bypass system that made it possible. Official fuel range of the P-38, 450 miles. Required range for Operation Vengeance, 1,000 miles round trip. Without McNeely's line, it was suicide. Lockheed engineers would later claim the Lightning's range was achieved through careful load balancing and flight management. The truth was cruder and far more human. It was achieved through one man's disobedience, executed in grease and darkness, never written into a manual. Years later, when historians dissected the mission, the technical reports all pointed to efficiency of drop tank integration and precision flight planning. None mentioned the bypass. The U.S. Army Air Forces didn't want the record to show that one of its most audacious victories had depended on a field modification unauthorized by regulation. but the pilots remembered. In 1985, at a veterans' reunion in Hawaii, Rex Barber raised his glass and said, "To the man who made the impossible flight possible, Doug McNeely. He gave us the gas." Those who were there said McNeely just laughed, shaking his head. He'd never thought of himself as an inventor or a hero. "I just fixed what was broke," he said. Yet, in that act of quiet defiance, he embodied the very spirit of wartime innovation, the dangerous, necessary alchemy of rule-breaking and necessity. America's deadliest fighter didn't come solely from blueprints or boardrooms. It came from a grease-stained mechanic on a humid island night, listening to engines whisper secrets that engineers refused to hear. The illegal line wasn't just a pipe. It was the artery that carried an idea, that courage in war could be mechanical as much as human. And on April 18, 1943, somewhere above Bougainville, that idea burned bright in the exhaust trails of 16 P-38s that flew farther than anyone believed they could. Lockheed's Burbank plant was called the Ranch, but it might as well have been a temple. Its walls shook with the pulse of a nation in motion, rivet guns clattering, foremen shouting, sparks raining down like ritual fire. Inside, men and women built dreams disguised as machinery. At the head of this cathedral stood Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson, the engineer who refused to believe in impossible. Tall, hawk-faced, impatient, he wore his slide rule like a weapon and his defiance like armour. Colleagues called him difficult. Admirers called him a genius. He preferred neither. "I just want it to work," he'd growl, chain-smoking as he rewrote aeronautical laws on napkins and blueprints. In 1937, the Army Air Corps had issued a radical specification: a fighter capable of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, unheard of at the time. Most companies laughed. Johnson didn't. He scribbled a sketch that same afternoon: twin booms for the engines, a central pod for the pilot, and guns mounted directly in the nose, a configuration no one had ever attempted. When he showed it to his superiors, they frowned. "It looks like a praying mantis," one said. Johnson smiled. "Then it'll eat everything in the sky." The prototype, the XP-38, first flew in January 1939. Test pilot Ben Kelsey described it as like nothing before or since. Sleek, silver and wicked, it cut through the California air with a shriek that turned heads from miles away. But the Lightning's genius came with danger. Its twin Allison V-1710 engines were temperamental. Its high-speed compression dives were lethal if the pilot didn't know how to recover. Still, Johnson believed in it. He drove the engineers mercilessly, inventing solutions in real time. When airflow over the tail caused instability, he designed compressibility flaps. When engine cooling failed, he reworked the nacelles overnight. "You don't solve problems in meetings," he said. "You solve them in metal." By 1942, production was in full swing. The P-38 was the only American fighter with the range and altitude to meet the Japanese on their own terms. In Europe, it was outmaneuvered by nimble Messerschmitts. In the Pacific, it was a godsend. Pilots called it fork-tailed devil, and so did the enemy. Yet Johnson's triumph was bittersweet. He knew that every Lightning that left Burbank was a compromise between what he'd designed and what bureaucrats would allow. "We build thoroughbreds," he wrote in a letter to a colleague, "and the army feeds them mule oats." The distance problem gnawed at him. Lockheed's official fuel tests projected maximum range at 450 miles with external tanks. Johnson wanted 600. He proposed modifying the plumbing to allow direct draw from twin drop tanks, the very idea that would later appear without authorization in McNeely's field modification. But procurement officers dismissed it. Too risky, too costly, not per spec. So Johnson filed the paperwork, cursed the system, and moved on to the next prototype. But the plans, annotated in red pencil, remained in his desk, a footnote in Engineering Rebellion. When the Yamamoto mission succeeded, Johnson was briefed privately. The Army credited his aircraft design, and he accepted the congratulations with polite disbelief. He knew the math. The P-38s had flown farther than any known configuration allowed. "Something's not right," he murmured to his assistant. "Either they lied about the tanks, or someone out there made it work." Years later, long after the war, when Johnson built the U-2 spy plane in total secrecy, he told his hand-picked Skunk Works team, "No committees, no delays. If you see a problem, fix it. I don't want another lightning incident, where a good idea has to be illegal to survive." In that sentence, the lineage of McNeely's midnight repair became legend. The Skunk Works ethos, autonomy, urgency, trust in the engineer, was born from the frustration of men who'd watched genius get buried under paperwork. Every rivet in the U-2, the SR-71, and every stealth craft that followed carried the DNA of that defiance. It began not in a laboratory, but in the grease and heat of a Pacific airstrip, where a mechanic had unknowingly vindicated a designer's unapproved dream. The P-38 had been born of audacity, conceived by a man who broke rules of aerodynamics and perfected by a man who broke rules of regulation. Between them stretched a thread of American invention, a belief that progress belonged to those reckless enough to ignore permission. Johnson later said in an interview, "The Lightning taught us everything: speed, power, endurance, and the price of obedience." He paused, looked into the distance, and added softly, "We never would have caught Yamamoto if someone hadn't disobeyed me first." The Dragonfly had become a weapon, and the dreamer had learned that sometimes the only way to make an airplane fly is to refuse to ask if it's allowed. At 7 a.m. on April 18, 1943, Guadalcanal woke to the sound of 16 engines snarling against the dawn. The men who climbed into those P-38s were lean, sunburned, and too young to understand the weight of the mission they'd just been handed. They were told only what they needed to know: fly 600 miles north, intercept a formation of Japanese bombers over Bougainville, and shoot down the one carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Every detail had been built from whispers, a single decrypted message obtained by U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo. It was chilling in its precision. Yamamoto's itinerary, departure time, altitude, and escort strength. To protect the secret, even the pilots didn't know the source. They were told only that the information was from the highest level. Major John Mitchell gathered his flight leaders around a crude chalkboard. The map stretched from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, 600 miles of ocean, islands, and Japanese radar. "We hit him here," Mitchell said, tapping a small inlet near Kahili Airfield. 9:35 local. We'll be there at 9:34. The room fell silent. Each pilot knew what was being asked of them. A mission at the outer limit of range, with no navigational landmarks and no second chances. The Army Air Force's planners had rejected the operation at first. Too far, too risky, impossible for fighters. But Admiral Nimitz's staff insisted, and Lockheed's engineers had sworn the Lightning could make the distance if properly managed. What they didn't know was that the assurance came from a mechanic's illegal fix, replicated in secret by squadron ground crews. On the tarmac, McNeely watched the men strap in. The night before, he'd checked every fuel line himself. The forbidden bypass gleamed like a vein beneath the wing roots. He patted the nacelle of Miss Virginia, Barber's plane, and muttered, "Bring her back, son. She'll hold." Takeoff was staggering. 16 Lightnings clawing into the air one after another, their twin tails slicing through the low clouds. They climbed to 10,000 feet, then levelled off, throttling back to conserve fuel. 2.5 hours of silence followed. No radio, no chatter, just the rhythmic hum of synchronized Allisons. Below them, the Pacific stretched infinite and merciless. One by one, the pilots checked their gauges. Fuel flow, steady. Pressure, stable. The illegal line was doing its work. Mitchell navigated by dead reckoning, a compass, a watch, and faith. At exactly 9:32, the coast of Bougainville appeared, a green smear rising from the mist. The formation dropped to 50 feet above the waves, running dark and silent, invisible to Japanese radar. At 09:34, Barber spotted the faint glint of silver in the distance. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and 6 Zero escorts. Mitchell barked into the intercom, breaking 2 hours of radio silence. Tally-ho! The lightning split into 2 elements. 4 climbed to meet the Zeros head-on. The others banked hard for the bombers. Barber's P-38 surged upward, throttles wide open, drop tanks jettisoned into the sea. The airframe shuddered with power. He closed from below and behind, his nose guns chattering in short, disciplined bursts. The first stream of tracer rounds found their mark, Yamamoto's plane. The right engine flamed, then the fuselage erupted in smoke. Witnesses later said the bomber rolled once before plunging into the jungle canopy, leaving a plume of black fire curling above the trees. The second Betty tried to escape seaward, but Lieutenant Holmes caught it in a climbing turn. 2 quick bursts and it disintegrated in mid-air. The engagement lasted less than a minute. 6 Zeros swirled in too late, their gunfire wild and uncoordinated. Mitchell's voice came over the radio again. Mission complete. Return south. It was over. The most precise and improbable interception in the history of aerial warfare. 16 fighters had crossed 1,000 miles of hostile sky and returned alive, all because their engines never coughed, their fuel never starved, and one mechanic had refused to follow orders. When the survivors landed at Guadalcanal, ground crews erupted in cheers. McNeely stood back from the crowd, watching Miss Virginia taxi to a stop. Barber climbed out, his face pale but calm. Their eyes met across the tarmac. Barber gave a thumbs up. McNeely only nodded, wiping his hands on his rag. That night, a message went out across the Pacific. Yamamoto confirmed dead. In Tokyo, shock rippled through the Imperial Navy. The Americans had reached into their skies, plucked out their greatest strategist, and vanished before anyone could respond. The newspapers would call it vengeance. The intelligence officers would call it a triumph of code-breaking. But among the pilots and mechanics of the 339th, it was remembered as something simpler. A flight that should not have been possible, made possible by the stubborn will of men who believed that rules were for peacetime. Above Bougainville, technology and defiance had converged in one perfect moment. And as the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber smouldered in the jungle below, the Pacific War quietly tilted in America's favor, carried there on the wings of a machine that had, for a single morning, outrun its own design. In the days after Operation Vengeance, Guadalcanal felt oddly still. The mission was officially over, but its shadow lingered in every hangar and workshop. Pilots spoke in low tones. Mechanics lingered at their benches, replaying each minute of the flight in their heads. It wasn't triumph they felt, not entirely. It was disbelief. The lightning had done the impossible. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew that what had happened on April 18th defied the numbers in every technical manual. The P-38's published range had been 450 miles with drop tanks. Mitchell's flight had flown nearly twice that distance and returned with enough fuel to spare for combat manoeuvring. In the official paperwork that followed, there was no mention of McNeely's bypass. The engineers who reviewed the flight logs chalked up the success to exceptional fuel discipline. The Navy reports praised Lockheed's superior engine performance. The Air Corps claimed optimal flight altitude and power settings. All true, perhaps, but not the whole truth. McNeely didn't care much for paperwork. He went back to his tools, fixing dents and replacing hoses as if nothing had changed. But word spread through the ground crews anyway. Mechanics from other squadrons began showing up to borrow his fittings. Soon, unauthorized bypass lines appeared on Lightnings all across the Solomons. Commanders knew, they just didn't ask. One afternoon, Colonel Dean Davidson from the 13th Fighter Command paid a quiet visit to the 339th line. He found McNeely under a P-38, half buried in oil and sand. "You the man who gave those planes extra legs?" Davidson asked. McNeely looked up, squinting. "Depends who's asking, sir." The colonel smiled thinly. "Someone who doesn't plan to write it down." He handed McNeely a cigarette. "Whatever you did, keep doing it, but keep your mouth shut." That was the closest thing to recognition McNeely would ever get. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts pored over reconnaissance photos from Bougainville. They showed the wreckage of two G4M Bettys, one of them reduced to little more than a charred skeleton of metal. Yamamoto's body had been found in the jungle, still seated, his white gloves untouched by the fire. The symbolism was too perfect for propaganda to resist. The man who brought war to America has met his fate. Yet within Lockheed's engineering department, the reaction was quieter, almost reverent. When word reached Kelly Johnson, he called his team together in the Burbank drafting room. "They made the range," he said simply. "Over 1,000 miles, in combat conditions." His engineers exchanged puzzled looks. They knew it couldn't be done with the standard feed system. One finally said, "They must have found a way to cross-feed the tanks." Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Who authorized that?" "No one," came the answer. He smiled, almost proud. "Good." A week later, Lockheed sent a technical bulletin to all Pacific Service commands, approving a newly tested auxiliary fuel system, a nearly identical copy of McNeely's modification. No credit, no names, no mention of the man who had risked a court-martial to make it work. But the change became permanent. From then on, every P-38 rolled off the line capable of the range that had killed Yamamoto. Across the ocean, the Japanese High Command reeled. Yamamoto had been more than an admiral. He was their strategist, their prophet of modern war. His death was a wound that bled morale across the entire Pacific. The Emperor's staff ordered secrecy, but word leaked through the ranks within days. One captured diary later recorded the mood. "The gods are no longer with us. Even the sky belongs to America." Back on Guadalcanal, the Lightnings came and went, each one bearing the ghost of that morning over Bougainville. Barber flew again, though he would later say that every time he throttled up, he could still see the Betty burning in the jungle. For McNeely, the war went on much the same. He never wrote home about the mission, never told his family what his hands had done. To him, it wasn't invention. It was necessity. When the 339th finally rotated home, he left behind a few coils of hose and a toolbox filled with bent wrenches. Mechanics who came after would use his fittings without knowing his name. The official histories would praise the P-38 as a marvel of engineering foresight. But in the metallic echo of its twin engines, there remained a trace of the truth, a whisper in the hum of every Allison that climbed into the sky. The message was simple. Greatness sometimes begins as a violation. In that unauthorized length of tubing lay the essence of wartime America, a faith not in bureaucracy or doctrine, but in hands, sweat, and the audacity to fix what others said couldn't be fixed. The Lightning's range had been extended by inches of stolen metal, yet those inches had changed the geometry of the Pacific War. In the quiet hangars of Guadalcanal, the men who knew simply called it the Miracle Line. And when they listened closely, they swore they could still hear the heartbeat of its creation, steady, defiant, and very much alive. By autumn 1943, the Pacific was shifting. The tide of the war, once dictated by imperial momentum, now followed the mechanical rhythm of American production. The skies over the Solomon Islands no longer belonged to the rising sun. They hummed with the metallic pulse of P-38 Lightnings, B-24 Liberators, and F-4U Corsairs. Every sortie, every interception, every mile of vapor trail traced back to a pattern born in defiance. McNeely's Miracle Line, that short illegal bypass of brass and hose, had multiplied into 1,000 sanctioned innovations. Lockheed's engineers studied field modifications from every combat zone, and what had begun as one man's disobedience became official doctrine. Adapt or die faster than your enemy. At the 339th Field Workshop, new modifications spread like folklore. Someone had figured out how to swap the standard ignition plugs for automotive variants scavenged from Jeeps, cheaper, more reliable under tropical humidity. Another crew built makeshift sun shields from flattened tin cans to keep engine temps down on the taxiway. Each of these hacks carried the same quiet heresy that had once terrified McNeely's commanding officer, fixing the rulebook by breaking it. Yet innovation has a price. In September 1943, during a maintenance inspection at Espiritu Santo, an engineering officer noticed the unapproved fuel assemblies still installed on a dozen Lightnings. His report triggered a brief inquiry. The Air Corps Logistics Office requested an explanation from Lockheed. The response, drafted by Kelly Johnson himself, was diplomatic genius. Field adaptations in the Pacific have validated our projections for extended-range systems under combat conditions. Recommend incorporation. No one was punished. The investigation disappeared into the same classified vaults that would one day hold the Operation Vengeance files. McNeely's modification was, officially, a factory improvement retrofitted in theatre. His name never appeared. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of April 18th rippled through the Japanese command structure like shockwaves in steel. Yamamoto's death had struck more than morale. It exposed a flaw in Japan's vision of technological superiority. Their fighter pilots, still flying Zeros with hand-cranked prop controls, now faced American planes guided by constant-speed propellers, turbo-superchargers, and oxygen-fed cockpits. The Japanese 4th Air Group's war diary, captured in 1945, recorded a blunt admission from a surviving officer. "We were told Americans had no discipline, but they have machines that discipline themselves." This was the quiet revolution of the P-38, a fighter that turned mechanical precision into autonomy, allowing its pilot to think strategically rather than mechanically. And behind that autonomy was the work of men like McNeely, whose improvisations gave the machine freedom from its own limitations. By late 1943, Lockheed's production had reached a tempo no Axis factory could match, over 200 P-38s rolling out monthly, each one bearing the mechanical DNA of its predecessor. Pilots now referred to the Lightning not as a fighter, but as a machine of reach. It could escort bombers to Rabaul and back, cross distances once thought impossible, and strike targets before the enemy even knew the sky had changed. Back home, newspapers published sanitized accounts of Operation Vengeance. The name itself was new, coined by a War Department press officer who wanted to frame the mission as divine justice. The public read of Yamamoto's death with pride, unaware of the engineering gamble that had made it possible. The story was heroism. The truth was machinery. McNeely was long gone from Guadalcanal by then. He'd been transferred to the 13th Air Depot in New Guinea, overseeing repairs for aircraft damaged in the push toward the Philippines. He rarely spoke of the Lightning. When younger mechanics asked about the long-range modification, he'd just say, "Sometimes you fix something that's not broken, because you know it will be." The war pressed on. The Lightning's legend grew, its twin booms slicing through Pacific humidity like the wings of a mechanical god. By war's end, P-38s would tally more aerial victories in the Pacific than any other Allied fighter, over 1,800 confirmed kills. Among them, the most symbolic, the death of the admiral who had once believed America too soft, too decadent, too mechanized to fight. In the post-war years, when historians gathered at the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation Symposium, The surviving Japanese officers spoke of Yamamoto's ambush with reverence. "It was a victory of calculation," one said, "but also of courage to use new machines in forbidden ways." McNeely's name never surfaced. His contribution lived in the quiet lineage of engineering design, the invisible hand that shaped a weapon capable of changing the Pacific. When he returned home to Kansas in 1946, the factories were already building cars again, the same assembly lines that had once built Lightnings now producing convertibles for peacetime highways. Sometimes, when he heard the steady hum of a six-cylinder engine, he swore it carried an echo of the twin Allisons he'd once coaxed to cross an ocean of war. He never patented his idea. He never even wrote it down. But in every aircraft that flew further than the blueprint allowed, his fingerprint remained. The reckoning of innovation wasn't a courtroom verdict or a medal ceremony. It was the quiet acknowledgement among men who built and flew machines that victory belonged not only to courage in the cockpit, but to defiance in the hangar. And somewhere, beneath the roar of every Lightning engine, there lingered a whisper. The sky was won by those who dared to fix it. In 1985, 4 decades after Operation Vengeance, the veterans of the 339th Fighter Squadron gathered in Hawaii for the Pacific Theater reunion. They were older now, grey-haired, stooped, their hands trembling slightly when holding coffee instead of throttles. But when they spoke, the years fell away. The room buzzed with the clipped cadences of call signs and tail numbers. In a corner of the hall, a display board bore black and white photos. The twin-boomed silhouettes of P-38 Lightnings, the faces of young men grinning under leather helmets, and a weathered map marked Bougainville, April 18, 1943. Someone had taped a caption beneath it, "The day the war turned in the sky." Rex Barber, one of the last living pilots from the mission that killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sat quietly, staring at a framed photo of his Lightning, Miss Virginia. When a reporter asked him what he remembered most about that day, Barber didn't mention the tracer fire, the explosions, or the kill. He said, "What I remember most was how far we had to fly, and that the engines never quit." It was a deceptively simple answer, but to those who knew, it was everything. Behind that reliability lay the ghost of a mechanic named McNeely. Official records listed him as Technical Sergeant, 339th Fighter Squadron, Engineering Section. His personnel file ended in 1946 with the note, "Discharged honorably." There were no citations, no mentions in unit histories, but ask any pilot who flew in the Solomons, and they'd recall the legend of McNeely's line, the field mod that stretched a fighter's range beyond regulation, the whisper that had become gospel in every maintenance shack. By the 1960s, Lockheed engineers revisiting wartime field reports confirmed the modification's lineage. They quietly incorporated its principles into the design of long-range fuel management systems for the F-104, Starfighter and U-2 reconnaissance plane. The same logic, balancing redundant flow lines, bypassing pressure failures, became the DNA of American aerospace innovation. What began as an illegal fix in a muddy airstrip shaped the next generation of high-altitude flight. At the reunion, someone passed around a Lockheed commemorative brochure celebrating 50 years of the P-38. Inside was a photograph of Kelly Johnson, the man whose restless engineering genius had made the Lightning possible. His quote read, "The difference between impossible and done is usually one mechanic who refuses to listen." For a moment the veterans were silent. Then one of them, Captain James Dunn, formerly of the 347th Fighter Group, said, "He's talking about McNeely." Heads nodded. They all knew. History remembers victories in numbers, sorties flown, tonnage dropped, aces confirmed. But the deeper truths are measured in hands, those that built, modified, and risked court-martial for the sake of survival. In the sterile archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, a faded memo from 1943 still exists, marked classified. 13 Fighter Command. Field maintenance adjustment approved under emergency authority. Increased range capacity verified in combat. Result: successful completion of Operation Vengeance. It never says how that adjustment was made, but the pilots knew. The Japanese records tell the story from the other side. The war diary of the 205th Air Group notes simply, at 0935, Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down by enemy twin-engine fighters of unfamiliar design. Engines emitted unusual noise, like two dragons breathing at once. For the men in those twin engines, it wasn't dragons, it was human audacity, measured in gallons, bolts, and faith that an idea could fly farther than authority allowed. When the Smithsonian restored a P-38 for display in the 1990s, curators discovered a small brass plate inside the left nacelle. It was stamped crudely, the letters hand-engraved. Modified per field order, 339th Engineer. McNeely. No one knew who placed it there. Some said it was a superstition among Pacific mechanics. Others believed it was the McNeely marking his work the only way history would allow. Today, visitors see that lightning gleaming under museum lights, its aluminum polished to perfection. They read plaques about dogfights, aces, and missions. Few notice the faint inscription inside the nacelle. Fewer still understand that it represents the bridge between desperation and invention, because that's what Operation Vengeance truly was. Not just revenge for Pearl Harbor, not even the surgical assassination of Japan's greatest admiral, but the proof of concept that in modern war, the smallest act of defiance could alter the course of nations. When the veterans dispersed that evening in Hawaii, the sky above Honolulu was streaked with contrails, commercial jets crossing the Pacific along invisible airways drawn in the war's wake. One of the men looked up and said softly, "They're still flying McNeely's line." And so they were. From Bougainville to Boeing, from mud-choked airstrips to stratospheric reconnaissance, that line, the literal and metaphorical, still connected the hands of mechanics to the flight of nations. April 18, 1943, would be remembered for its precision, its courage, and its kill. But beneath the roar of every lightning that day was the heartbeat of an outlaw idea. Not all revolutions are fought with bullets. Some begin with a wrench, a rule book, and one mechanic crazy enough to ignore both.